Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I'm making a video response to my good friend MKVine, who did a video response to Zia Ahmed's video about whether Jesus was truly a proper sacrifice in the Jewish context, whether Jesus fulfilled the criteria of being a blood sacrifice, an atoning sacrifice for the sins of the Jewish people. Now, one thing I want to make very clear is that, I watch both videos. I'm very familiar with Zia Ahmed's video because he has posted them as a supporting video response to several of my videos. And I watched MKVine's video, and I'm going to be responding to a lot of things he put in the text, the more info box, on the side of his video, but I'm going to mention some of the things that he mentioned verbally in his video as well. First off, MK, and I mean this with really no disrespect at all, I must say I have rarely ever seen someone pull off a more successful straw man in my entire life. And again, I know that might sound mean, because I know most people view, and it is, a straw man as a fallacy in an argument, in a debate and in a discussion, so I don't mean that as an insult. I'm actually kind of giving you props here. I don't think I've ever seen one pulled off so well. You do, however, to your credit, get to Zia Ahmed's points later on in your video when you actually go through some of the sacrificial requirements, and you do discuss them. I don't know if you really refute them, but you go through them and you discuss, but you lean upon the evidence you had brought forward in the first half of the video, which was the death of a righteous person and the atoning power supposedly this has in rabbinical traditions and things like this. When I say straw man is because, of course, Zia Ahmed's video had nothing to do with the death of a righteous person. The video had to do with animal sacrifice, and you segued into the righteous person dying. Hence why I say your video is a successful straw man argument. You refuted him only because you brought up a totally different topic. The only similarity is that this has to do with atonement for sin. Now, I'd be very interested to see where you got your information from. I spent several hours, well, not several hours, but it certainly felt that way, Googling and looking at Jewish websites I'm familiar with, like Jews for Judaism, Judaism 101, looking up their definition of atonement for sin. And none of these major Jewish websites, Messiah Truth, which is a Jewish apologetic website, none of these websites mention the death of a righteous person and atonement for sin, which makes me think that this is not something that is part of mainstream Jewish thought, and this is not something that is a wholly part of the religion. For example, if you talk to a Trinitarian Christian, of course, he's going to talk about the Trinity. Similarly, when you ask a Jew about Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, he's going to mention the precepts of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, yet none of these websites discuss righteous person dying for atonement. Even Wikipedia, and again, as all of you know, I use Wikipedia in more of a loose joking manner. Even Wikipedia doesn't mention a righteous person dying for, the result of his death is that there's an atoning power. So I'd be very interested to see where you got your information from. Whether you actually did dig this up from rabbinical sources, or you got this from somewhere else. I would just be curious. Going down some of the lists here, you mentioned in Numbers chapter 8, verse 10 and 19, that it was the Levites that served to make atonement or turn away wrath on behalf of the Israelites. I think that's sort of, I don't know if that's really a good idea. You should have put that in there, in the context of your video. You're implying that it was the Levites literally that atoned for sin. However, you look at the context of that entire chapter, it's referring to the Levites, referring to Moses, referring to Aaron, sanctifying, and that they are the ones that are the ones that actually do the sacrifices. So it's not literally the Levites, it's the fact that they're the ones that are charged with the job. And I couldn't find any commentary in my Stone edition of the Torah that said otherwise. You mentioned the attempted sacrifice of Isaac atones. You said the rabbis taught this. Again, my Stone edition of the Torah, maybe I'm blind, I don't know, but I couldn't find that anywhere in my commentary. Perhaps you have it somewhere. you mentioned in 4th Maccabees. Now, I find that kind of interesting. You're citing 4th Maccabees. Of course, 4th Maccabees is an apocryphal book, considered apocryphal by not just Christians but Jews themselves. Not part of any canonized Bible that I'm aware of. Maybe the Eastern Orthodox has it. I don't really rightly know, but I know the Jews don't have it. It's not part of the Tanakh. In fact, my commentary on 4th Maccabees and my Access Bible here, the scholars say that there's so many historical problems and theological issues with 4th Maccabees that we could spend a video talking about how that one is not a very valid piece of evidence. So I would say that your usage of it, in my mind, from a scholarly perspective, is rather, is rather irrelevant. But for the sake of argument, okay, yeah, the martyrs die and God atones the land. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment, since that's the point of your video. You mentioned 2 Samuel 21:12-14. You said that that the death of the men in 2 Samuel 21:12-14 appeased the Gibeonites, and then God answered prayers on behalf of the land. That's not really what the text says. The text says that because they preserved the bones of the dead people in the water, it was actually the rainfall that proved God's atonement, not necessarily the death. If you look at the commentary in the Tanakh, and I have it for the Stone edition of the Tanakh, it's the rainfall signaled the atonement, not the actual death of the people. And it was because they did what they were supposed to do by preserving the bones and then burying them properly that God atoned, not because literally of the death. You mentioned some other things which I really don't have access to. A lot of substance from the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Zohar. I really don't have access to any of that. You did mention in the Torah, you mentioned the death of Miriam, and you mentioned Rashi saying that the death of a righteous person is for atonement. However, I believe it's Ramban in his commentary on the same verse does not mention the atonement of a righteous person at all. Or the death of a righteous person equals atonement. So, while I do agree Rashi is considered one of the greatest rabbis and scholars in Judaism, it's interesting to note that that's not the only opinion on the substance of that verse. Again, one thing I want to point out is that the reason why I call your video a straw man is because Zia Achman's video has not been refuted. The fact is that you cannot divorce and say that Jesus equals this apparent rabbinical righteous person dying as a result of his death as atonement, because there are two different theologies going on here. In Judaism, okay, yeah, someone who is righteous dies, God atones sin. Okay, fair enough. Of course, I would like to point out Ezekiel chapter 18, which says that no one, essentially, to boil it down, no one bears the sins of anybody else. But, I guess that's something that I guess could be considered a contradiction as in terminologies. But another thing I want to point out is that, okay, in Judaism, a righteous person dies, God atones sin. But the atonement and the sacrifices doesn't stop there. There is, again, you mentioned Moses, according to rabbinical literature, asking God, well, what about when there's no temple, no tabernacle? And he says, well, until there is, again, a temple and tabernacle, if a righteous person dies, I'll atone sin on behalf of that. Implying that there would eventually then be a tabernacle and a temple. The fact is that these atonements are not the same as the supposed Christian theology spin on the death of Jesus. Jesus is God incarnate, according to Christianity. His death on the cross, according to Hebrews chapter 10, is directly linked to the sacrifice of animals in the temple, not linked to righteous people dying, as in rabbinical literature. So Zia Achman is right in refuting that claim, because if the Christians are going to say that Jesus' death on the cross was the equivalent of animal sacrifice, which Hebrews chapter 10 alludes to, and Christian theology alludes to, then of course if they're going to say he equals animal sacrifice, Zia Achman refutes that claim, because that of course is ridiculous according to Jewish theology. His video still stands. The Jews do not believe a righteous person is God incarnate, and therefore his death is for all the sins of all of the mankind, and thus no sacrifice is needed afterwards. When these righteous people died, according to Judaism, sacrifices still continued. So really we're dealing with apples and oranges here. We're dealing with Christians taking this theology of a righteous person dying and then God atones, hijacking it and timesing it by 20, and giving it theological attributes which are foreign in Judaism. So I would say that your video really doesn't refute anything. You educated people, but it doesn't refute the concept. Thank you for watching. Peace be with you all.